Beneath the sun-baked earth and within the soul of a rugged landscape lies a story not of a single kingdom, but of a civilization with the patience of mountains. This is the tale of the land cradled between rivers and peaks, a place the world would come to know, and sometimes fear, as Persia. Its legacy is not written in sand, easily swept away, but etched into the very bedrock of history. A story of incredible firsts, profound ideas, and an identity that refused to fade, even when empires turned to dust. How did a collection of highland tribes forge an ethos that would captivate and influence the globe for millennia? The answer begins not with marble palaces, but with the first, stubborn shoots of barley breaking through ancient soil. Our journey starts in the profound quiet of prehistory, in the formidable embrace of the Zagros mountains. Long before the pharaohs ruled the Nile, communities here were learning to coax life from a hard land. As far back as 7,000 years before the Common Era, villages nestled in these valleys cultivated wild grains and pulses. But this was no mere struggle for survival. The discovery of vessels from this epoch, holding the residue of fermented grapes, whispers a tantalizing secret. Here was a culture already seeking richness, already understanding celebration. This burgeoning society was not alone. To their west, in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, the glittering city-states of Sumer were rising. And their influence, like water finding a path, flowed eastward. This contact led to the founding of a city destined for an almost unbelievable longevity, Susa. Established perhaps over 6,000 years ago, Susa would become the heartbeat of the first recognizable civilization in this region, Elam. For an astonishing span, Susa thrived. Imagine a city witnessing the entire sweep of ancient history, from the pyramids of Egypt to the rise of Rome, only finally falling silent under the hooves of Mongol horses millennia later. But what was Elam? It was less a centralized kingdom and more a resilient confederation of mountain peoples. Their identity was forged by the highlands. They were, in their own tongue, the people of the high country. This distinction is crucial. It created a fundamental contrast with their wealthy lowland neighbors in Mesopotamia, the people of the plain. Life in the arid, rocky Zagros was different. It did not allow for the vast, irrigated fields of Babylon. Elamite society was built on semi-nomadic herding and small, tenacious plots of farmland. This bred a different kind of person, perhaps fewer in number, but fiercely independent, resilient, and tough. Their strength was not in sprawling bureaucracies, but in endurance. Can you see how this mountain spirit would become a cornerstone of the Persian character? Yet, for all its endurance, Elam remains shrouded in silence. Their unique script, one of the world's oldest, has stubbornly resisted full decipherment. Their language is a linguistic island, unrelated to any around it. So, how can we know them? We listen to what they left behind, their art. In a fascinating divergence from their neighbors, Elamite artisans rarely focused on human kings or godlike hybrids. Instead, their world was populated by powerful animals, mighty bulls, loyal dogs, creatures of strength and nature. This suggests a religion deeply woven into the natural world, centered around a mother goddess worshipped in sacred groves and high places. Their faith was remarkably open, readily adopting deities from other cultures into its own pantheon. Does this hint at an early Persian trait of cultural adaptability? Furthermore, their art reveals something startling for the ancient world. Women held a position of clear respect. Queens stood beside kings as equals, suggesting a social fabric more balanced than many that followed. This thread of respect, once woven, would never fully unravel from the Persian tapestry. Elam's history was a turbulent dance of conflict and commerce with Mesopotamia. They were often the underdog, outnumbered by the rich, populous city-states of the plains. In fact, history's first recorded war ended with Elam on the losing side, invaded by Sumerian forces. Yet they were not forever subdued. Around 1100 BC, a powerful Elamite king reversed the tide, surging into Mesopotamia and briefly making Elam the dominant power. But internal strife, that recurring poison of empires, weakened them, allowing a Babylonian king to strike back. This cycle of rise, fracture, and conflict would become a familiar rhythm in this land. Through it all, Elam's true power may have been its connections. Excavations at Susa have uncovered treasures from the distant Indus Valley, from Afghanistan, from eastern Iran. This was a hub in an ancient global network. Afghanistan supplied a crucial resource, tin, essential for making bronze. Elam likely acted as the middleman, funneling this vital metal to Mesopotamia and beyond. They traded stone, timber, and metals, highland goods for lowland grain. These rugged paths would one day evolve into the Silk Road, with Persia eternally at its crossroads. But a slow, seismic shift was underway on the Great Eurasian Steppe. Nomadic peoples, speaking languages that would form the basis of Persian, began a gradual migration. These Indo-Iranian groups didn't arrive as a conquering horde, but seeped in over centuries, integrating with the Elamites and others. Remarkably, Elamite culture proved sticky. Long after these new peoples became dominant, the Elamite language persisted in administration. The old mountain people were not erased, they were absorbed, their knowledge grafted onto new power. From this fusion, new tribes emerged: the Medes, the Persians, the Parthians. And it was the Medes who first forged a unified Iranian power, a direct response to the cruel oppression of the Assyrian Empire to their west. Under a king historians call Deioces, and later his grandson Cyaxares, the Medes built alliances and an army. In 612 BC, in a moment of cathartic destruction, they and their Babylonian allies razed the hated Assyrian capital of Nineveh to the ground. The Medes had brought the Iranian peoples together and toppled a giant. But their moment at the summit would be brief. For waiting in the wings, in the land of Pars, was a tribe with a leader whose vision would eclipse all that came before. The stage was set not for a Median empire, but for a Persian one. What kind of man could unite the tribes and build something the world had never seen? The mantle of leadership passed from the Medes to a people from a southern region known as Pars. And from Pars arose a figure who would not merely rule, but redefine the very concept of empire. His name was Cyrus. History would remember him as the Great, a title earned not just through conquest, but through a revolutionary spirit of governance. How did a ruler from a relatively minor vassal kingdom forge the largest realm the world had yet witnessed, and do so with a philosophy that still echoes today? Cyrus's early life is clouded in legend, a mix of folklore and political propaganda. One persistent tale suggests a betrayal at the heart of the Median court, where a general named Harpagus, sent to subdue the rebellious Persian, instead joined his cause. Whatever the precise machinations, by 550 BC, Cyrus had overturned Median supremacy. But this was just the beginning. He didn't stop at merely replacing one master with another. He embarked on a breathtaking campaign of unification, bringing the disparate Iranian tribes under a single, stable banner. What set Cyrus apart was his architecture of power. He established a model of administration that balanced central control with local tradition. The empire was divided into provinces, each overseen by a governor or satrap. But these officials were watched by a network of royal inspectors, the king's eyes, who reported directly to Cyrus, minimizing corruption and ensuring loyalty. Efficiency was paramount. He revived the ancient Elamite capital of Susa as his administrative nerve center, connecting it to the empire's corners with a revolutionary courier system. Relay stations were placed so that a rider was never more than a day or two from fresh horses, food, and rest. Messages and decrees could flow across thousands of miles with unprecedented speed. Can you imagine the awe this inspired? A command from the king could travel from the heart of Persia to the shores of Anatolia in mere weeks. This system was so effective that future empires, from Rome to the Incas, would adopt its principles. Its influence stretched even to the founding of the United States, where Thomas Jefferson drew inspiration from ancient Greek accounts of Cyrus's methods. But Cyrus's greatness was cemented in 539 BC, with the fall of Babylon, the magnificent and feared metropolis of Mesopotamia. His entry into the city was not marked by the typical slaughter and pillage. Instead, he presented himself as a liberator. His most famous act, recorded in the Hebrew Bible, was to allow the Jewish people, exiled in Babylon for decades, to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. This single decree made him a unique figure in religious history, a non-Jewish Messiah, anointed by the God of Israel. To the Babylonians, he was also a deliverer, freeing them from a despised king. To the Persians, he was the father. These titles reveal the core of his policy: remarkable tolerance. He respected the customs, religions, and laws of every people he brought into his fold. He did not seek to crush identities, but to harmonize them under a just umbrella. His empire was a mosaic, not a monolith. His military might was embodied in an elite corps, the 10,000 immortals. This perpetually full-strength unit, its ranks instantly refilled, became the terrifying, unwavering spearhead of the Persian army for centuries. Yet, for all his military prowess, Cyrus's empire was built with comparatively little of the bloodshed that characterized other conquerors. He showed a consistent respect for civilian populations and their holy sites. When he finally fell in battle, his tomb was built not as a towering pyramid, but as a simple, dignified stone chamber on a plain. It stands today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a poignant symbol of a leader who preferred substance over spectacle. His son, Cambyses II, pushed the empire's boundaries further, swallowing the ancient kingdom of Egypt and extending Persian reach along the Mediterranean coast. The Achaemenid Empire, as it was known, now stretched from the Indus Valley to the Nile, a scale of dominion that was literally unimaginable a generation before. The next great architect of this empire was Darius I. He consolidated and expanded, pushing into the Indus Valley and solidifying control. But Darius is most remembered in the West for the event that would define Persia's relationship with Europe for centuries: the first major invasion of Greece. In 490 BC, a Persian expeditionary force landed at the plain of Marathon, near Athens. The confident Persians expected to brush aside the fractious Greek hoplites. What they met was a wall of bronze, discipline, and desperate resolve. Against all odds, the Athenian phalanx shattered the Persian lines in a stunning victory. A runner, according to legend, sprinted the 26 miles to Athens to announce the victory before collapsing dead, giving birth to the marathon race. For Darius, it was a humiliating, infuriating setback. He vowed a massive, definitive retaliation, but died before he could launch it. The task of avenging Persian honor fell to his son, Xerxes. Xerxes assembled a colossal force, an army and navy of legendary size meant to crush Greece utterly. He bridged the Hellespont Strait with boats, a symbolic mastery over nature itself. In 480 BC, his forces swept into Greece. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force led by Spartan king Leonidas made a legendary, doomed stand, holding the vast Persian army for days. Though the Persians broke through, the sacrifice became a symbol of Greek defiance. Xerxes' navy then met the united Greek fleet in the Straits of Salamis. In the confined waters, the massive Persian ships became a chaotic, vulnerable target. The agile Greek triremes destroyed them. Watching from a golden throne on the shore, Xerxes witnessed his dreams of conquest sink beneath the waves. He retreated hastily to Asia, leaving a land force behind. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, that remaining army was decisively defeated. The Persian invasion had ended in catastrophic failure. Xerxes himself would later be assassinated by his own guards. Did this mean Persia was finished? Far from it. The Greco-Persian Wars, immortalized in Western lore as a victory of freedom over tyranny, were ultimately a border conflict on the fringe of a vast empire. For Persia, it was a painful setback, not a mortal blow. The Achaemenid Empire remained the superpower of the age, its heartlands untouched, its wealth undiminished. The struggle for influence in Anatolia and the Aegean would continue for generations, a cold war of antiquity. But the empire's true legacy wasn't forged solely on battlefields. It was built in the arid landscape of Iran itself, through an intimate, brilliant dance with a precious, scarce resource: water. While kings waged wars on distant frontiers, the true endurance of Persia was being engineered at home, in a lifelong struggle against aridity. The Iranian plateau is a land of stark beauty and profound challenge, receiving scant rainfall. How does a civilization not just survive, but flourish, in such an environment? The Persian answer was one of breathtaking ingenuity, a testament to a culture that thought in centuries, not seasons. Their mastery of water management became the hidden bedrock of their power, a quiet revolution more lasting than any military campaign. Consider the Shushtar hydraulic system, a masterpiece conceived under Darius the Great. This was not a simple canal. It was a complex, multi-level engine that diverted the force of a river to serve human need. It powered watermills for grinding grain, created a stunning artificial waterfall for climate control, and irrigated nearly 100,000 acres of orchards and fields, transforming a dry region into a fertile garden. It was a symphony of stone and current. But perhaps their most iconic invention was the cannon. This was a technology of profound humility and intelligence. Instead of digging canals that would lose precious water to the searing sun, Persian engineers tapped into underground water tables at the foothills of mountains. They dug a gently sloping underground tunnel, often for miles, to guide this hidden water by gravity to the surface where it was needed. At regular intervals, vertical shafts were dug down to the tunnel for construction, maintenance, and ventilation. From above, these shafts looked like a line of mysterious craters marching across the desert, a signature on the landscape. The cannon was resilient. It was safe from surface evaporation, from the destruction of armies, from the silt of floods. It was a sustainable, life-giving artery. Building one was a colossal communal effort, requiring precise mathematical calculation to maintain the perfect slope. This technology, born in Persia, would travel along the Silk Road as far as Morocco and even Spain, a gift of survival. What does it say about a people who pour their genius not only into palaces, but into the very soil? Their practicality extended to daily preservation. In the cold winter months, they harvested ice and snow, storing it in clever, dome-shaped subterranean chambers called yakshals. These structures, with their thick mud brick walls and sophisticated ventilation, kept ice solid throughout the blistering summer, allowing for food preservation and even the creation of cool desserts. It was an ancient form of refrigeration. Beyond survival, Persia nurtured culture and leisure. The world may owe them the melancholic, intricate melodies of the tar, a stringed instrument considered a forefather of the lute and the guitar. They gifted humanity one of the oldest known board games, backgammon, a contest of strategy and chance played for millennia. And while the origins of chess are debated with India, Persia embraced and refined it, calling it shatranj and passing it to the wider world. Within this vast, diverse empire, society presented fascinating contrasts. Slavery existed, particularly in conquered territories like Babylon and Egypt, where it was a long-standing institution. Yet, evidence suggests it was less pervasive and perhaps less brutal than in contemporary Greece or later Rome. The Persian economic engine relied more on a vast network of paid laborers, skilled craftsmen, and a land-owning peasantry. But the most striking social feature was the status of women. For its time, it was remarkably advanced. Persian women could own and manage property, run businesses, control their own finances, and enjoyed considerable freedom of movement. Aristocratic women engaged in activities like horseback riding and even archery, pursuits reserved solely for men in many other cultures. They traveled, they influenced, they lived visibly in the world. The primary restriction seemed to be formal political rulership. There were no Persian queens regnant. Yet, their agency was undeniable. Can you see the echo of that ancient Elamite respect, now woven into the fabric of a world empire? From this rich cultural soil arose one of Persia's most profound and enduring gifts to the world, a new vision of the divine. This was Zoroastrianism, one of humanity's earliest monotheistic faiths, and its influence would ripple across continents and religions. Its founder, Zarathustra, or Zoroaster to the Greeks, is a semi-legendary figure. Tradition places him in the 6th century BC, possibly a contemporary of Cyrus, but some scholars believe he lived far earlier, his life and message mythologized over time. His teachings presented a universe framed by a cosmic struggle. On one side stood Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of wisdom, light, and truth. Opposing him was Ingra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of evil and deceit. This was not a petty squabble of Olympus, but a grand, moral dualism that encompassed all creation. Central to this was the concept of free will. Humans were active participants in this battle, their choices steering the world toward light or darkness. This theology introduced concepts that feel familiar today. A clear notion of the afterlife, a final judgment, a heaven and a hell, and a rich cosmology of angelic and demonic beings. Scholars see its profound influence on the development of Judaism during the Babylonian exile and subsequently on Christianity and Islam. The three wise men, the Magi, who visit the infant Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, are specifically identified as Zoroastrian priests. The faith's core principle was Asha, truth, order, righteousness. It was a call to active goodness, to tending the world. This likely influenced Cyrus's emphasis on just law and righteous rule. Fire was a central symbol, not worshipped, but revered as a representation of Ahura Mazda's light and purity, always kept alight in temples, often alongside flowing water. Notably, Ahura Mazda was omniscient, but not omnipotent. The ongoing struggle with evil meant his power was not absolute. This theological nuance, along with a deep reverence for the natural elements, earth, water, air, made the faith distinct. The Achaemenid Empire, for all its autocratic power, demonstrated a unique blend of strength and tolerance, order and cultural freedom. It was, in many ways, a crucible of early globalization. Its roads carried not just soldiers and taxes, but ideas, goods, and gods. It showed that an empire could be strong without being crushingly homogenizing. But could such a colossus last forever? History whispers that no empire is eternal. The very expanse and sophistication that made Persia mighty also presented a glittering target. And from the rugged mountains of a small, fierce kingdom to the west, a storm was gathering. A young king, raised on tales of Persian splendor and Greek heroism, was looking east. He was not just a conqueror, he was a prodigy, a student of Aristotle, and a man possessed by a legend. His name was Alexander, and his arrival would test the resilience of the Persian idea itself. Was the empire's sophisticated administration a strength, or a brittle shell waiting for the right hammer blow? The dance of destiny was about to quicken its pace. The storm from the west was personified in a young king whose ambition was forged in a potent mix of myth, philosophy, and martial fury. Alexander III of Macedon was not merely a general, he was a phenomenon. Educated by the great philosopher Aristotle, he devoured the epic of the Trojan War and, more importantly, an account of Cyrus the Great's life and methods. From his youth, he was fixated on the East, on the legendary wealth and scale of Persia. He saw himself not as an invader, but as an heir, a successor to a legacy he aimed to surpass. By the age of 20, having secured his throne in Macedonia with ruthless efficiency, crushing rebellions and leveling the ancient city of Thebes as a brutal warning, he turned his gaze across the Aegean Sea. His father, Philip, had unified the Greek world under Macedonian leadership. Now, Alexander would use that combined force for a purpose that seemed audacious to the point of madness: to topple the superpower of the age. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont into Anatolia with an army that was elite, loyal, but modest in size, perhaps 40,000 strong. He faced the sprawling, multinational forces of the Persian Empire, commanded by its monarch, Darius III. Their first major confrontation came at the river Granicus, where Alexander led a daring cavalry charge across the water, shattering the Persian defense and securing a foothold in Asia Minor. But the true test was at Issus, in 333 BC. Here, Darius himself took the field with a vast army, confidently choosing a narrow coastal plain for battle, believing his numbers would overwhelm the Macedonians. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The terrain nullified his numerical advantage, compressing his forces. Alexander, with tactical genius, focused his shock attack directly on the point where Darius stood in his royal chariot. What happened next would echo through history. As the Macedonian cavalry phalanx spearheaded by Alexander himself broke through the Persian lines and surged toward the imperial center, Darius faltered. Seized by panic, he turned his chariot and fled the field. his sudden retreat triggered a cascading collapse of the entire Persian army's morale. The king had abandoned his soldiers, his family, and his honor. The aftermath was telling. Alexander captured Darius's mother, wife, and daughters. Rather than mistreat them, he afforded them every courtesy befitting their royal status. It was a calculated act of chivalry and propaganda, contrasting his own nobility with Darius's cowardice. He reportedly told the captured queen mother that he was not making war on women, and that Darius remained his only rival. But the message was clear: the mantle of legitimate kingship was now in contest. Darius, from a safe distance, offered a staggering ransom for his family and proposed a treaty ceding all lands west of the Euphrates. Alexander's general Parmenion famously said, "I would accept if I were Alexander." Alexander's reply? "So would I if I were Parmenion." His ambition was boundless. He would settle for nothing less than the entire empire. He continued south, meeting fierce resistance at the ancient Phoenician city of Tyre, situated on an island. The 7-month siege that followed was a showcase of Alexander's relentless engineering genius, building a massive causeway to reach the island walls. When the city finally fell, his punishment was brutal. Thousands were executed, and survivors were sold into slavery. It was a stark reminder that his magnanimity had sharp limits. Gaza suffered a similar fate. Egypt, weary of Persian rule, surrendered without a fight, welcoming him as a liberator. There, he was declared a pharaoh, a son of the god Ammonius. He founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, a city destined to become a beacon of learning. But his ultimate goal still lay to the east, Darius and the heart of Persia. The final, decisive clash came in 331 BC on the plains of Gaugamela, in modern-day Iraq. Darius had learned from his mistakes. He chose wide, flat terrain perfectly suited for his cavalry and scythed chariots. He had a larger, rested army. The stage was set for a Persian redemption. For much of the day, the battle raged on a scale unlike any Alexander had faced. The Persian cavalry pressed hard on the Macedonian left. At a critical moment, Darius unleashed his chariots and a cavalry charge aimed at Alexander himself on the right flank. Alexander, in a masterful tactical pivot, allowed a gap to open in his line, drawing the Persian forces in, before wheeling his elite companion cavalry in a devastating oblique strike. Once again, he drove directly for the Persian command post. And once again, Darius saw the tide turning against him. He turned his chariot and fled. For a second time, the king's flight doomed his army. The great host disintegrated into a routed mob. Alexander pursued, but Darius escaped into the eastern provinces. The military power of the Achaemenid Empire was broken. Alexander marched triumphantly into Babylon, then to the Persian ceremonial capitals of Susa and Persepolis. At Persepolis, the magnificent palace complex filled with unimaginable treasures, he allowed his troops to plunder. After months, a great fire erupted, consuming the palace's wooden structures. Was it a deliberate act of revenge for the burning of the Athenian Acropolis by Xerxes 150 years prior? An accident during a drunken revel? Ancient sources contradict each other. Regardless, the burning of Persepolis was a potent, tragic symbol, the end of the Achaemenid dynasty. Alexander now hunted Darius, who was a king without a kingdom, a prisoner of his own fleeing court. Finally, in the remote deserts of what is now Iran, Darius was murdered by his own satraps, who hoped to curry favor with Alexander. The Macedonian king found the body. In a final act of respect for the office, he sent Darius's remains to Persepolis for a royal burial. The empire was now his. But what did conquest mean? Alexander did not merely seek to be a Macedonian ruler of Persia. He aimed to fuse the two worlds. He began adopting elements of Persian dress and court protocol. He appointed Persians to administrative posts. Most controversially, he promoted a mass marriage of his Macedonian officers to Persian noblewomen at Susa and enlisted Persians into his army ranks. This policy of fusion created deep resentment among his Macedonian veterans, who saw it as a betrayal of their culture and a dilution of their privileged status. They grumbled that their king had gone native. Yet, Alexander's vision was grand, a unified Greco-Persian ruling class for a new world empire. Could such a synthesis have lasted? We will never know. In 323 BC, in the humid heat of Babylon, Alexander the Great fell ill. After days of fever, the man who had conquered the known world and reshaped its map died. He was 32 years old. On his deathbed, when asked to whom he left his empire, he supposedly whispered, "To the strongest." With those words, he unleashed chaos. The colossal realm, held together solely by the force of his personality and the loyalty to his person, had no clear heir. The ensuing wars of his generals, the Diadochi, would tear his inheritance apart. But what of Persia itself? Was it simply a conquered territory, or would its ancient spirit once again find a way to reassert itself? The Hellenistic age had begun, but the Persian story was far from over. In the power vacuum left by Alexander's breath, his empire shattered like a dropped vase. His generals, the Diadochi, carved the vast territory into rival Hellenistic kingdoms. For Persia, this meant rule by the Seleucid dynasty, founded by one of Alexander's officers, Seleucus. The Seleucids governed from Syria, planting Greek cities and promoting Greek culture across their domain, a process called Hellenization. Greek became the language of administration and elite discourse. In places like the newly founded Seleucia on the Tigris, Greek-style theaters and gymnasiums rose. For a time, it seemed the Persian highlands might be absorbed into this cosmopolitan Greek world. A remarkable outpost of this fusion even flourished far to the east, in Bactria, modern Afghanistan, where a Greco-Bactrian kingdom blended Greek art with Buddhism, creating serene statues of the Buddha draped in Hellenistic robes. But the Persian core, the Iranian plateau, proved a stubborn custodian of its own identity. The Greek veneer was thin here, applied mainly to the urban elite and the administrative surface. In the countryside, in the temples, and in the hearts of the local nobility, the old ways endured. The Zoroastrian priesthood kept the sacred fires burning. The memory of the Achaemenids lingered. The Seleucids, perpetually distracted by wars with the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and later with the rising power of Rome in the west, could not maintain a firm grip on their eastern territories. The land was ripe for a reassertion of Iranian rule. And it came not from a settled kingdom, but once again from the dynamic, nomadic fringe. Enter the Parthians. Originally a tribe from the steppes of Central Asia, they had been settled within the empire for centuries. They were Iranian in language and culture, heirs to the same traditions as the Medes and Persians. In the mid-3rd century BC, as Seleucid power waned, a Parthian leader named Arsaces led a rebellion, carving out an independent kingdom in the region of what is now Turkmenistan. This was the seed of the Parthian Empire. Their rise was slow, methodical, and relentless. They were masters of the horse, and their military would become the stuff of Roman nightmares. The backbone of their army was the cataphract, a heavily armored horseman, both rider and steed clad in scale mail, wielding a long, powerful lance. But their true signature was the horse archer, lightly armored, incredibly mobile and lethal. Their most famous tactic was the Parthian shot. A horseman would feign a panicked retreat, drawing enemy cavalry into a reckless pursuit. Then, at full gallop, he would twist in his saddle and fire arrows backward with devastating accuracy. It was a tactic of controlled deception and immense skill, designed to break the cohesion and morale of any pursuing force. This military system would make them the most formidable eastern rival Rome ever faced. In 53 BC, at the Battle of Carrhae, a Parthian force annihilated a Roman army led by the triumvir Crassus. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. Legend says the Parthians, knowing of Crassus's infamous greed, poured molten gold down his throat after his death, a symbolic end for a man who sought wealth above glory. The Parthian political system was unique. It was less an autocratic monarchy like the Achaemenid model and more a feudal federation of powerful noble families. The King of Kings ruled, but his power was balanced by a council of great aristocrats. Intriguingly, this council held the authority to depose a king deemed unfit, a remarkable check on royal power for the ancient world. This system, while occasionally leading to succession disputes, provided a degree of stability and prevented the kinds of debilitating civil wars that often plagued Rome. For nearly 500 years, the Parthians held the line against Roman expansion eastward, dominating the trade routes of the Silk Road and becoming fabulously wealthy. Culturally, they presided over a full synthesis. They were Iranians ruling an empire that still contained strong Greek cultural elements in its western cities. They tolerated a multitude of faiths. And from this mix emerged a potent religious phenomenon, the cult of Mithras. Mitra was an ancient Iranian deity of covenant and light, related to Mitra in the Zoroastrian pantheon. In the cosmopolitan, militarized borderlands of the empire, this figure evolved into Mithras, the central god of a mystery religion that would later sweep through the Roman legions. It was a secretive, all-male cult with ranks of initiation, ritual meals, and a focus on the bull-slaying savior Mithras. It would become Christianity's most significant rival in the Roman Empire's final centuries. Can you see the journey? An Iranian spiritual concept, filtered through Hellenistic syncretism, traveling west to capture the imagination of Roman soldiers. But empires, even resilient feudal ones, eventually ossify. The Parthian nobility grew increasingly independent and fractious. A series of brutal wars with Rome, while often successful in defense, drained resources. The final blow came not from a foreign enemy, but from within the Iranian heartland itself. In the province of Persis, the ancient homeland of Cyrus and Darius, a local Persian dynasty nurtured the flame of the old Achaemenid legacy. They were the Sassanians. In 224 AD, after defeating the last Parthian king in battle, Ardashir I founded the Sassanian Empire. This was no mere change of dynasty, it was a national restoration. The Sassanians consciously revived the glory of ancient Persia. Zoroastrianism was reinstated as the powerful state religion, with an organized priesthood and fire temples across the land. The title King of Kings of Iran was used with profound intentionality. Art and architecture flourished, creating some of the most magnificent palaces and rock reliefs in Persian history. The Sassanian period is often considered the zenith of pre-Islamic Persian civilization. It was a centralized, bureaucratic state, more akin to the Achaemenid model than the Parthian Federation. It fostered incredible advances in science, medicine, and astronomy. The game of chess, as we know it, was formalized here. Legendary texts of wisdom and epic poetry were compiled. They even engaged in sophisticated cultural diplomacy with their contemporaries, exchanging ambassadors, musicians, and artists with Tang Dynasty China and the Byzantine Empire. Under Khosrow I, known as the Immortal Soul, the empire reached its peak, with a flourishing academy of learning at Gunshaper that welcomed scholars of all faiths, Zoroastrian, Christian, Jewish, and Indian. Yet, this glittering empire was locked in an epical, exhausting struggle. Its primary rival was no longer a distant republic, but the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. For over 4 centuries, the two superpowers clashed in a series of devastating wars over the rich lands of Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Syria. It was a conflict that drained both titans of men, money, and spirit. Then, in the 6th century, a catastrophe struck that neither could withstand: the plague of Justinian. Sweeping out of Egypt, it ravaged the entire Mediterranean world and Persia, killing millions and crippling economies and armies. The Sassanian Empire, though it made a final, spectacular surge under Khosrow II, briefly capturing Jerusalem and Egypt from the Byzantines, was left hollowed out, overextended, and brittle. Khosrow was overthrown and murdered in a palace coup in 628 AD, plunging the empire into a bloody 4-year civil war as multiple factions fought for the throne. The mighty Sassanian state was brought to its knees not by a foreign army, but by internal chaos and exhaustion. And as the dust of the civil war began to settle, a new power, unified by a potent faith and burning with expansionist zeal, was looking north from the Arabian Peninsula. The ancient world was about to witness a transformation more profound than any conquest by Alexander. The last echo of Cyrus's empire was fading, and a new chapter for the Iranian plateau was being written in the script of a new revelation. While Persia lay wounded from its internal convulsions, A transformative force was coalescing in the deserts to the south. The Arab tribes, long divided and often dismissed by the great empires, had been united under the banner of a new faith, Islam. The message preached by the Prophet Muhammad created a political and religious community with an explosive energy. Upon Muhammad's death in 632 AD, the Rashidun Caliphate launched its armies northward. The weakened Byzantine Empire lost Syria and Egypt with stunning speed. The Sassanians, despite their exhaustion, were the next target. The first Arab probes into Mesopotamia were rebuffed, but they were a warning. The real invasion came in 636 AD at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. The Sassanian army, still formidable but led by a divided nobility and perhaps lacking the conviction of their ancestors, was decisively defeated. The heartland of Mesopotamia, the jewel of so many empires, fell. By 642 AD, at the Battle of Nahavand in the Iranian highlands, a clash so momentous the Arabs called it the victory of victories. The last organized Sassanian resistance was shattered. The empire crumbled within a decade. The last Sassanian king, Yazdegerd III, became a fugitive, eventually murdered in distant Merv. An era of 13 centuries, stretching back to Cyrus, had closed. The Islamic conquest was a watershed, but not an erasure. The Arab conquerors imposed new rules: the jizya tax on non-Muslims, the appropriation of prime lands, and the gradual promotion of Arabic as the language of administration and religion. Zoroastrian fire temples were destroyed or converted. Many sacred texts were lost. A significant number of Zoroastrians chose exile, with communities eventually finding refuge in India, where they became known as the Parsis. Yet, for the majority of Iranians, conversion to Islam was a slow process, taking centuries. And in a profound historical irony, while Islam politically subdued Persia, Persian culture began a patient, deep conquest of the Islamic world itself. The Umayyad Caliphate, which succeeded the Rashidun, ruled from Damascus as an Arab aristocratic empire. Persians were often second-class citizens. But the sheer administrative complexity of governing the former Sassanian lands forced reliance on the existing Persian bureaucratic class, the same secretaries and administrators who had served the Sassanians. They brought with them systems of finance, taxation, and governance far more sophisticated than those of the Arab tribal leaders. A simmering resentment against Umayyad privilege, combined with this Persian administrative influence, fueled a revolution. In 750 AD, the Abbasid dynasty seized power, and their success was deeply indebted to Persian support. The Abbasids moved the caliphate's heart eastward, closer to the Persian sphere. The founding of Baghdad in 762 AD was a symbolic masterstroke. It was built near the ruins of ancient Ctesiphon, the Sassanian capital, and of Babylon itself. But it was designed as a circular, cosmopolitan metropolis, a melting pot. Under the Abbasids, Persian culture ceased to be merely tolerated. It became the defining aesthetic and intellectual tone of the Islamic Golden Age. Persian viziers wielded immense power. Persian poetry, music, and art set the standard for courtly life. The caliphs adopted Sassanian-style court ceremonies and regalia. The legendary Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, in Baghdad was not just a library, it was a vast translation institute where teams of scholars, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, translated the great works of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac science and philosophy into Arabic. Here, the works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Persian scientific texts were preserved, studied, and expanded upon. Papermaking technology, learned from Chinese prisoners of war, made books cheaper and knowledge more accessible than ever before. This was Persia's second great period of intellectual fluorescence, now within an Islamic framework. Scholars with Persian names made staggering contributions. Al-Khwarizmi, from whose name we get algorithm, systematized algebra. Al-Razi, Rhazes, was a pioneering physician and chemist. Omar Khayyam, immortalized as a poet in the West, was a brilliant mathematician and astronomer. The epic Shahnameh, Book of Kings, composed by the poet Ferdowsi around 1000 AD, was a monumental act of cultural preservation. Written in Persian, it wove the mythical and historical tales of pre-Islamic kings and heroes into a unified national epic, ensuring the Persian language and its legendary past would never be forgotten. It was a defiant, beautiful declaration that Iranian identity had survived conquest. But political power follows its own cycles. The centralized might of the Abbasid Caliphate gradually withered. From the east, a new wave of nomadic Turkish horsemen, the Seljuks, converted to Islam and entered the political arena as military mercenaries, much like the Germanic tribes in the late Roman Empire. By the mid-11th century, the Seljuk Sultanate was the real power, with the Abbasid Caliph remaining as a symbolic religious figurehead in Baghdad. The Seljuks were Turkic, but they embraced Persian culture with fervor, adopting the Persian language for administration and becoming great patrons of Persian art and architecture. They ruled through the existing Persian bureaucratic machinery. Once again, the pattern repeated. A new, militarily dominant group from the steppe was assimilated into the sophisticated Persian administrative and cultural mold. This Seljuk Persian synthesis produced wonders, like the stunning turquoise-tiled mosques of Isfahan. It also triggered one of the most consequential conflicts in world history. The Seljuk conquest of Anatolia from the Byzantines directly provoked the Pope to call for the First Crusade in 1095, aiming to reclaim the Holy Land. The Crusades would become a bloody, centuries-long point of contact, and sometimes surprising cultural exchange, between Christendom and the Islamic world, with Persia-influenced realms at its heart. Yet, even as this new hybrid civilization thrived, a shadow was lengthening across the eastern horizon. It was a shadow cast not by a state, but by a gathering storm of unparalleled fury. A united force of nomadic tribes was emerging from the Mongolian plateau, led by a man whose name would become synonymous with apocalyptic destruction, Genghis Khan. The relatively orderly pattern of nomadic integration was about to be shattered by something entirely different, a whirlwind of pure, systematic annihilation. The Persian world was about to face its most severe test. The storm from the east arrived not as a new ruling class seeking assimilation, but as an elemental force of destruction. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century were a catastrophic rupture, different in kind from all previous nomadic incursions. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols perfected warfare as total terror. Their strategy was psychological as much as military: offer surrender and integration, or face utter eradication. Cities that resisted were methodically obliterated, their populations massacred, their libraries burned, their very foundations ripped up. The sophisticated irrigation networks, the qanates that were the lifeblood of the arid plateau, were deliberately destroyed, turning fertile regions into desert. The goal was not just conquest, but the dismantling of any potential for future resistance. In 1258, the unthinkable happened. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, besieged the legendary Abbasid capital, Baghdad. After a siege, the city fell. The accounts are horrifying: hundreds of thousands killed, the Tigris River reportedly running black with ink from countless destroyed books, then red with blood. The House of Wisdom was annihilated. The last Abbasid caliph was executed, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, a Mongol custom for sparing royal blood from being spilled on earth. The sack of Baghdad is often marked as the brutal end of the Islamic Golden Age. For Persia, it was an unparalleled demographic and cultural disaster. Can a civilization survive when its cities are made graveyards and its waterways are broken? Yet, the indomitable Persian capacity for endurance reasserted itself, though in a wounded land. The Mongols eventually settled, forming the Ilkhanate dynasty in the Persian region. And a familiar process, however stunted, began again. The conquerors, pragmatic rulers, needed to govern the ravaged but still complex territory. They turned to the surviving Persian bureaucracy. Within a few generations, the Ilkhans converted to Islam, often favoring the mystical, intuitive path of Sufism, which resonated with their own spiritual traditions. Persian administrative language was restored. There was a partial rebuilding. But the trauma was deep, the scars permanent. Just as a fragile recovery seemed possible, two more calamities struck in the 14th century. The Black Death swept along the very trade routes the Mongols had once secured, devastating a population already diminished. And then from the ashes of the Mongol Empire itself arose another figure of apocalyptic conquest, Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur, a Turkic Mongol claiming descent from Genghis, was a paradox of refined cruelty. A patron of art, architecture, and poetry who built breathtaking monuments in his capital Samarkand, he was also a strategist of genocide. His campaigns across Persia, the Caucasus, and India were exercises in calculated horror. His signature tactic was the construction of pyramids of human skulls outside conquered cities, a grisly warning to the next. His invasion in the late 14th century re-soaked the soil of Iran in blood, undoing the Ilkhanate's fragile recovery. He is estimated to have been responsible for the deaths of millions. His empire, like Alexander's, died with him, fragmenting among his heirs. The 15th century saw Persia fractured among smaller, competing Turkic tribal confederations, the Black Sheep and White Sheep Turkmen. For perhaps the first time since Elam, the Iranian heartland lacked a strong, unifying central power. It was a land of fragments, vulnerable and searching for a new cohesive principle. That principle emerged not from a sword, but from a powerful spiritual idea. In this atmosphere of disorder and longing, a dynamic religious movement gained tremendous force, Shura Islam. While the Sunni branch had been dominant under caliphs and sultans, Shurism, with its narrative of martyrdom, justice for the oppressed, and the awaited return of a hidden divinely guided leader, resonated deeply in a population weary of chaos. A Sufi religious order in Ardabil, in northwestern Iran, became the nucleus for this revival. Its leaders, the Safavids, blended Shura theology with the charismatic authority of a Sufi master. In 1501, a young, charismatic leader named Ismail, of mixed Turkmen, Kurdish, and Georgian ancestry, conquered Tabriz and proclaimed himself Shah. He declared Twelver-Shurism the official state religion of his realm and enforced it with dramatic fervor. This was a decisive break. Persia was now a Shura island in a Sunni Muslim sea, a distinction that would define its geopolitical identity to the present day. Shah Ismail's Safavid empire rapidly reconstituted the classical Persian borders, controlling Iran, parts of the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and exerting influence over Afghanistan. They faced their great rival to the west, the Sunni Ottoman Empire, now master of Constantinople and the Balkans. The Safavid-Ottoman conflict was a clash of empires and ideologies, a struggle for control of the fertile Mesopotamian plain and the lucrative Silk Road trade. It was also a religious war, Sunni versus Shura, that burned for centuries. To counter the Ottoman threat, the Safavids did something novel. They sought allies in Christian Europe. They opened diplomatic relations with the Habsburgs, the Venetians, and later the English, creating an early form of geopolitics based on "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." The empire reached its zenith under Shah Abbas the Great in the early 17th century. A brilliant reformer, he moved the capital to the magnificent city of Isfahan, which he adorned with sublime mosques, palaces, and the iconic Nakshi-Jahan Square, a public space of breathtaking scale and beauty. He reformed the army, creating a slave soldier corps modeled on the Ottoman janissaries to reduce his dependence on unreliable tribal levies. With English naval help, he expelled the Portuguese from the strategic Strait of Hormuz. Persian carpets, silks, and art became coveted luxury exports to Europe. The Safavid era was a final, glorious flowering of the classical Persian artistic genius, now expressed through the medium of Islamic architecture and craft. But the seeds of stagnation were sown in this very brilliance. A reverence for tradition began to stifle innovation. Intellectual inquiry, once the hallmark of Persian civilization, grew rigid, focusing on commentary rather than discovery. While Europe embarked on the scientific revolution, Persia's scholarly gaze turned increasingly inward. After Abbas, weaker Shahs more interested in palace pleasure than governance took the throne. The central authority decayed. And on the peripheries, old threats reawakened. To the east, Afghan tribes, once subdued, rebelled and even briefly captured Isfahan in 1722. To the north, a new, expansive power was pushing southward with relentless ambition, the Russian Empire of Peter the Great. Persia, once the feared empire, was now seen as a weakening prize by its neighbors. The ancient cycle seemed to be turning once more, but this time, the external forces were not nomadic horsemen, but modernizing, imperialist states armed with cannons and a global appetite. Could the ancient kingdom adapt to a world whose rules were now being written far from the mountains of Persis? The 18th century opened with Persia in a state of fragmentation and vulnerability. The Safavid collapse had invited a familiar script, a talented military commander from the frontiers seizing power. This was Nader Shah, an almost mythical figure of ruthless brilliance. Rising from humble origins, he expelled the Afghan invaders and then embarked on a campaign of breathtaking scope, aiming to restore, and even surpass, the ancient boundaries of Persian glory. His most legendary exploit was a lightning invasion of the crumbling Mughal Empire in 1739. He defeated a vastly larger army, sacked Delhi, and carried back to Persia treasures of almost unimaginable value, including the famed Peacock Throne and the Kohinoor diamond. With this wealth, he financed wars to reclaim the Caucasus from the Ottomans and Russians. For a moment, it seemed a new Persian empire was born. But Nader's genius was corroded by paranoia and growing cruelty. His later reign was a tyranny that bled the land he had reunified. His assassination in 1747 plunged the country back into civil war, a stark lesson that conquest alone could not forge stability. From this chaos emerged the Qajar dynasty in 1796, establishing a capital in Tehran. The Qajars, a Turkic tribe, restored a degree of order, but they ruled a Persia that was no longer the feared center of the world. It was now a piece on a new global chessboard, where the players were industrialized European empires with insatiable ambitions. The 19th century became a story of relentless pressure and painful contraction. To the north, Imperial Russia, expanding for centuries, viewed the Caucasus and Central Asia as its natural sphere. In two disastrous Russo-Persian wars, Iran was forced to sign treaties ceding vast territories in the Caucasus, modern-day Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, and confirming Russian dominance over the Caspian Sea. To the south and east, the British Empire, protectors of its jewel in the crown, India, sought to buffer its holdings from Russian influence. Persia was caught in the middle of this great game. The Qajar Shahs, often weak and corrupt, responded by playing the powers off against each other, effectively selling economic concessions to the highest bidder. This culminated in the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention, which cynically divided Iran into spheres of influence without a single Persian voice at the table. The nation's sovereignty was a fiction. Yet, this humiliation sparked a fire. A constitutional revolution between 1905 and 1911 forced the Shah to accept a parliament and a constitution, a brave, nascent attempt to build a modern, democratic state. But it was strangled by internal divisions and, crucially, by continued foreign interference. When the parliament moved to reclaim control of the nation's resources, the British and Russians engineered a coup. The message was clear: Persia's destiny was not its own to determine. The discovery of oil in 1908 turned Iran from a strategic prize into an economic one, deepening the foreign entanglement. During World War I, despite declared neutrality, the country became a battleground for Ottoman, Russian, and British troops, its soil trampled and its people suffering. In the aftermath, a military officer, Reza Khan, staged a coup with British acquiescence. In 1925, he crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding a new dynasty determined to drag Iran into the modern world by sheer force of will. He was a secular nationalist in the mold of Ataturk in Turkey. He built railroads, industrialized, established a national education system, and implemented legal reforms. He forcibly unveiled women and mandated Western dress, seeking to break the clergy's social power. But his modernization was authoritarian, imposed from above without popular consent. His alliance with the West soured when, during World War II, his perceived sympathy for Germany led Britain and the Soviet Union to invade and occupy Iran to secure oil and supply routes. He was forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The younger Shah initially promised a constitutional monarchy. But the pivotal moment came in 1951, when the popular Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, championing Iranian sovereignty, nationalized the British-controlled oil industry. In response, in 1953, the American CIA and British MI6 orchestrated a coup that overthrew Mossadegh and restored the Shah to absolute power. This event poisoned the relationship between Iran and the West for generations. For the next 25 years, the Shah, now firmly backed by the United States, pursued a program of aggressive modernization and westernization known as the White Revolution. Land reform, women's suffrage, and vast infrastructure projects transformed the country's surface. But it was a dictatorship, enabled by a brutal secret police, the SAVAK. The gap between a wealthy, westernized elite and the traditional, religious masses grew into a chasm. The Shah's perceived subservience to America and his suppression of Islamic and leftist opposition created a tinderbox of resentment. In 1979, the tinderbox exploded. A coalition of leftists, liberals, and most powerfully, a network of Shia clerics led by the exiled Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, toppled the monarchy. The Iranian Revolution was not just a change of government, it was a radical refounding of the state as an Islamic Republic, governed by the principle of Velayat-e-Faqih, guardianship of the Islamic jurist. It was a defiant rejection of both Western imperialism and Eastern communism, asserting a third path based on Shia Islamic principles. The seizure of the American embassy and the 444-day hostage crisis severed ties with the West. Soon after, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, with backing from Arab states and both superpowers, invaded, hoping to exploit revolutionary chaos. The resulting 8-year war was a brutal, sacrificial struggle that cemented the revolutionary regime's hold on power and deepened its siege mentality. Today, the Islamic Republic of Iran stands as one of the world's most resilient and consequential civilizations, carrying the weight of its entire epic history. It projects influence across the Middle East, champions a Shia axis of power, and pursues a nuclear program that brings it into confrontation with the international community. It is a nation of profound contradictions, ancient and modern, revolutionary and conservative, isolated yet deeply connected. Its people are heirs to the poetry of Hafez, the science of Al-Khwarizmi, the empire of Cyrus, and the faith of Zoroaster and Khomeini. From the highland villages of Elam to the cyber realms of the 21st century, the Persian thread has never snapped. It has been stretched, dyed new colors, woven into different tapestries, Hellenistic, Islamic, Mongol, modern, but it remains identifiable, strong, and unbroken. The mountains and deserts that forged a people of resilience and adaptation still define them. The story of Persia is the ultimate testament to the endurance of culture, the persistence of identity, and the indomitable spirit of a civilization that has looked into the abyss of conquest and oblivion countless times, and each time, found a way to rise again, transformed but eternal. Thank you for listening to this epic journey. If you found solace and fascination in the deep tides of history, consider letting Sleepy Owl be your guide to other lost worlds and enduring legacies. A simple subscription helps us continue weaving these tales for you. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the echoes of great civilizations. Good night.